Well, I don't know if you read the Deseret News, but this week, the front page of the Deseret News, in large print, says, the drought is ground zero here. Water is like gold in the West, and folks fight over gold. Today's topic will be water inequality. You can see the title of our lecture here on the screen. Just Add Water, Hydrating Human Rights in the Desert of Inequality. And we spoke in this room last week on food inequality, and I'm excited to pair that discussion with one today on water inequality and the way that water, as a precious resource, affects patterns of inequality across communities. I'm really pleased to announce and to introduce our speaker, who is Rhett Larson. Rhett Larson is a graduate of BYU. He is currently the Richard Morrison Professor of Water Law at Arizona State University's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and is a senior research fellow with the Kyl Center for Water Policy at the Morrison Institute for Public Policy. Professor Larson's research focuses on the impact of technological innovation on water rights, including dispute resolution in Arizona and throughout the Colorado River Basin. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Rhett Larson.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for braving the snow. I brought the moisture with me. And thanks so much to the Kennedy Center, to Professor Meekum, to Dr. Shumway, and to everyone who's made me feel so welcome. I've had a chance to give lectures all over the world to lots of different universities, but I confess it is pretty special to come back to my undergraduate institution and be invited by one of my favorite professors and mentors. So this is really a special opportunity for me. Now, people ask me all the time, how did I get into water law? There's probably lots of reasons. One of the reasons probably is that I grew up in Arizona. I'm from a multi-generational farming and ranching family in the desert, so I'm sure that seeped into my psyche somehow. But I think a large reason that I was really inspired to work in water policy came over 20 years ago as a missionary. So as a young missionary living in the Dominican Republic, a massive hurricane struck the island while I was there. And what shocked me in the weeks and months of rebuilding and rescue efforts was how central water was. We were dying of thirst in water up to our waists. And everything felt easier if we could just get some clean water to drink. And everything felt harder without water. And so the more I just thought if we could just fix one problem in the world, maybe we could just get everybody some clean water. And I think when just in talking about the topic of this lecture series, engaging global inequality is so massive it can feel overwhelming when you look at it. And you can think, where can we even begin to solve a challenge like global inequality? And I think the point of my talk today is, how about we begin at the beginning, the fundamental molecule of life? How about we begin with water and see how many problems seem a little more solvable if we can just get everybody enough clean water. Now, this idea didn't begin with me. There's lots of ideas driving this conception. One of those ideas comes from one of my favorite philosophers, Isaiah Berlin, who would say, in quoting Dostoevsky, he would say, "Boots before Pushkin. We should always put first things first." Meaning that we don't go to someone who's dying of cholera or thirst and tell them, don't worry, you've got a right to freedom of religion and a jury trial, right? We begin with water, and that sort of goes to the John Rawls conception of primary goods, that there's some goods that are so essential for the exercise of all other rights that we need to secure those first. And water is certainly a quintessential example of a primary good, essential for the exercise of all other rights. But the challenge with water is that water's complicated. It's different. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations about the water diamond paradox. Why is it that diamonds are worth so much money when they're not very useful, but water, which is the most useful thing, is worth so little money? There's lots of reasons why that might be the case. Some people might say scarcity, but we live right now in a place of relative water scarcity, and yet water's fairly cheap. One of the reasons might be the very topic that we're talking about today, the human right to water. Water is a human right, so we don't want it to cost a lot of money. Water is such a fun, fascinating area to study, in part because water is everything that gold or oil or gasoline is. It is a valuable, saleable commodity. But at the same time, it is everything that faith and music and culture and art is. Because we don't throw lumps of coal at each other in the wintertime, and we don't squirt each other with gasoline in the summertime, and we don't baptize our children in uranium. Water's just a different resource. We feel about it differently, and because of that feeling, because of its symbolic power, it's harder to manage water, if also more fun. Now, in the same way that during my experience as a missionary, water connected to every other problem. It connected to food, it connected to public health, it connected to housing. Water was part of the solution to every problem we were facing in that hurricane. Water is also a part of virtually every problem we face in society. So take climate change, for example. The reason most people are going to care about climate change is because of water. It's droughts, floods, plagues, and wars. The reason climate change will matter to most people is because of water. And water has all these cascading effects because water is embedded in everything. It is embedded in this jacket. It is embedded in the electricity coming out of these lights. It's embedded in all of the food that you eat. It is embedded in you, which means water policy is a part of all policies. What about gender inequality? What's the relationship between water and gender inequality? Right now, throughout the developing world, there are young women and girls who spend hours and hours and hours every day in water gathering activities. And that's time that they are not spending in school. If we can bring accessible, clean water closer to people's homes, that's more opportunities for girls and young women to go to school, and that is what changes countries and changes the world. On top of that, one thing that's always important to never lose sight of when we talk about the human right to water is that it has to be combined with the conception of access to sanitation. For all sorts of social reasons, there are taboos around talking about poop, pee, and periods. But the more we get rid of those social taboos and we're willing to talk to each other about the importance of those issues in managing public health and in expanding access to education, that there are dignified, safe, sanitary conditions for everyone, that's an important part of water policy. What about public health? Every day, 6,000 children under the age of 5 will die because of a lack of access to clean water. I know we have all been through a terrible time during this pandemic. It has been awful and devastating. We've lost loved ones. But COVID-19 is not now, nor was it ever, the greatest public health crisis facing the world. Those little children that die every day just because they can't get a clean drink of water, that's a place where we need to invest and consider. And think about all the other people dying of water-related and water-based diseases. Mosquitoes breeding in water that's close to human habitation, spreading malaria, spreading Zika, schistosomiasis as it breeds in snails. These are deadly, devastating communicable diseases, all revolving around water policy. What about poverty? One of the things that drives poverty in water law and policy, we say all the time, water doesn't flow downhill, water flows to money. And poverty comes into play all the time when it comes to access to clean water. What about racial inequality? Flint, Michigan is a perfect example of the way that race and racism factors into water policy and has disproportionate impacts on minority communities. And this is true in minority communities all around the world, including many indigenous communities, including neighboring indigenous communities right here in Utah, like the Navajo Nation, who face uranium contamination from historic mining in their water supplies. Oh, there we go, hang on. What about religion? Water and religious rights intersect in a whole variety of ways, from the religious significance of the Ganges River and the complications that creates in water management, to river personhood, legally treating rivers like people, which is a new thing that's sort of been developed in communities, for Maori communities in New Zealand, to the obvious religious significance of the Jordan River and the way that factors in to hydrodiplomacy in that region. All the way to disputes that I've worked on myself, the religious significance of the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona to the Navajo, the Hopi, and the Walupai people, and the use of reclaimed water or treated wastewater to make fake snow on that mountain, which was seen as a desecration of their sacred site. What about migration? If you look at patterns of mass migration around the world, maybe people are doing what they have done for thousands of years. They're just following water. If you look at these patterns of migration, people are leaving places of water insecurity and fleeing to places of water security. And they may be saying we are looking for peace or we are looking for prosperity, but peace and prosperity are functions of water security. A lot of the work that I've been doing over the last several years has been working in refugee host communities, and the amount of strain that's placed on many of these communities as they absorb thousands of refugees, as they were already dealing with a water crisis themselves, has created a lot of complex diplomatic and social dispute challenges in these regions. What about armed conflict and the relationship with water? So in the Syrian civil war, sort of leading up to the Syrian civil war, we saw drought in the Euphrates River Basin, failure of crops, rising food prices, mass urbanization, dry kindling for radicalization, dry kindling for instability. The same thing happened with the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, drought in the Kabul River Basin, rising food prices, failing crops, urbanization, dry kindling for instability. Now, I don't want to make it sound like water is the reason that these conflicts happen, but it's often an underappreciated aspect. Indeed, the conflict right now in the Ukraine, if you'll pay close attention, a lot of the strategic objectives from the Russian forces has been securing control over the northern Crimean Canal, which carries water from the Dnieper River into Crimea, essential for its agricultural development. Without entering into Ukraine and controlling the Dnieper River in that canal, there's not enough water supply to fully develop Crimea. The 6 Years' War was sort of precipitated early on by the bombing of diversions on the Jordan River on the Yarmouk, so Israel bombing diversions from Syria. It's all sorts of complex ways in which armed conflict relates to water. But water mostly is a source of peace. Mostly water brings us together. It is a catalyst for cooperation. It is not a coincidence that our earliest lessons, the cradles of our civilization, where we learned to live in bigger communities than families and tribes, occurred along the banks of desert rivers. That's where we learned how to live with one another. And those lessons continue today. Most of the time, water is peaceful. Most of the time, water helps us overcome disputes. Now, what are the sources of the human right to water? As these early civilizations began to expand, they began seeding the world with different conceptions of a human right to water. So the Roman Empire, for example, as the Roman Empire spread, it seeded the conception of riparian water rights, which is the Roman approach to allocating water rights. If you own land that directly abuts a river, you have the right to take a reasonable amount of water from that river. But inside of Roman law was also the conception of a natural use. A natural use is per se reasonable, meaning no matter what, you can't argue that that person does not have that right to the water. And what is a natural use? It's a subsistence use. Anything that is used to keep you alive is considered per se reasonable. So it's the beginning, the seeds of a conception of a human right to water. What about the British Empire? The British Empire seeded the conception of royal charters. These royal charters were monopolies that were granted by the crown, and inherent in those royal charters was the duty to serve and not discriminate, which means if we granted you a royal charter to provide water, then you had to provide water to anyone who came and could only charge a reasonable price. So again, one of the earliest forms of a civil right in European law was the duty to serve if you were a monopoly. What about the spread of the early caliphates, including in particular the Umayyad Caliphate and much later the Ottoman Empire? These empires spread conceptions of Sharia law that had deeply embedded inside of them water rights. So under Sharia law, there is the right to shirb, the right to drink, and shafa, the right to irrigate. These two rights, even in areas where they don't formally recognize Sharia law, the Ottoman water code was so influential in the development of their national water laws that you still see elements of Sharia law as they were adopted through the Ottomans. So for example, in Sharia law, we distinguish between public and private waters. And for example, a Malakite Sunni may say that no one can charge money for the provision of public water, so water from a lake or a river. But a small spring or a well on your land, you're allowed to charge money to someone only if they are able to afford to pay for it. Whereas a Hanbalite Sunni may say you can never charge for water under any circumstances. And you see these sectarian differences are influential in water policies in different regions. So for example, a lot of my work in the last several years has been in refugee host communities in Lebanon and Jordan. Lebanon and Jordan, 1 out of every 4 people in Lebanon right now is a Syrian refugee. And the impact that that's had on water access. Jordan, 1 out of every 8 people is a Syrian refugee. And Jordan is the second most water insecure country in the world after Yemen. The impact that this influx of refugees has had on host communities. These host communities, the Jordanians and Lebanese have been incredibly hospitable to the Syrians for the most part. But when thousands and thousands and thousands of people are moving into communities that are already water stressed, it creates tensions between the refugees and their host communities. And one of the interesting challenges is we've been working for the last several years to develop these kinds of water supplies, so improved water treatment for groundwater and augmented water supplies by condensing atmospheric water vapor to produce household level water supplies. But running into different conceptions of water privatization as governed by that old Ottoman water code has been really challenging. So for example, in some places we can't charge for water, but how do we make enough money to make the water system financially sustainable? One thing that we've done is that under Sharia law, under these Ottoman conception of water, selling the waste stream from the water treatment to construction sites is okay, since it's not being used to drink. And so we were able to make enough money off of selling water to construction to be able to make these financially viable. One of the really complicated things is this new technology. We're working with a company called Zeromass Water that has these solar panels that condense atmospheric water vapor to produce drinkable water. But a lot of imams and clerics have not totally wrapped their mind around. Is that a public water or private water under Sharia law? It's been a really complicated and fascinating challenge. Now, I want to spend just the last few minutes giving you, talking about some different case studies in the human right to water and what lessons we can learn. So India, for example. India recognizes a constitutional right to water, and yet 38% of people in India lack access to tap-treated water sources. 44 million people a year in India are suffering from waterborne diseases. So just recognizing a human right to water in your constitution is insufficient. We have to do something more than that. Now, Ecuador, a country I'm familiar with and have worked in for a while, amended their constitution to recognize a constitutional right to water and banned water privatization. That's created a lot of challenges because it means that for many of these public systems, they lack access to private capital to improve their water systems. But I've seen interesting lessons. So for example, Guayaquil has the last remaining private water system that was grandfathered in Ecuador. And they're really struggling. And a lot of people in Ecuador say, well, that's a perfect example about how water privatization is bad because the worst system is in Guayaquil. But the people who amended the Constitution are in charge of the government, and they've not been particularly hospitable to private water companies. And Guayaquil's in a very different situation than Cuenca or Quito, which sit way up at the top of the Andes and get all this beautiful water coming off of these glaciers. Guayaquil's at the coast and gets all of that runoff as it hits the ocean. It's a much different system. But I've worked a lot in the city of Cuenca, and they've found some really great success in achieving a human right to water. I think part of that has been because their public utility, Etapa, has complete control over their water source. So the Parque Nacional Las Cajas is their water source. And instead of having their forestry department run their water source or their game and fish, the water source is run, this national park is run by a water utility, which means they don't run it for hunting or fishing or recreation, they run it as a water source. Additionally, they've invested a lot in water education, which I think is a really important part of how we develop a human right to water, is educating people about water. And because they're not just a water utility, they're also a telecommunications utility, they're able to cross-subsidize, which means they've been able to keep their water rates relatively low. What about the water conflict, the Cochabamba water war in 2000? So Cochabamba, Bolivia, suffering from massive water insecurity, approached the World Bank and said, we need a loan to improve our water system. The World Bank responds, you betcha, but you're going to have to privatize the system. Cochabamba agrees, without any competitive bid, enters into a 40-year concession contract, $2.5 billion, with a U.S. consortium run by Bechtel called Aguas del Tunari. Aguas del Tunari comes in and raises water rates by 38% and bans all traditional water gathering activities. As you can imagine, massive protests against the government for this move. It's one of those things you always have to be careful of with water, which is if you develop a water system and you wonder, why are the people still going to the river? Why are the people still going to the well? You have to understand that cultural importance of water, that water is a place where people meet around and they go to. If you don't appreciate that in water policy, the way water brings people together, your water projects are doomed to failure, which is something Aguas del Tunari did not appreciate when they banned traditional water gathering. Now, massive protests against the Bolivian government, against Aguas del Tunari, resulted in fatalities both amongst protesters as well as amongst Bolivian security forces until the concession contract was rescinded. And the water problem has persisted. I think one of the lessons we can take from Bolivia is that water privatization in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The failure in Bolivia was not because of privatization, it was because of public corruption. A no-bid 40-year, $2.5 billion contract to run people's water, where there's no competition, there's no oversight, there's no regular review period, meant it was rife for corruption, which means there's a close relationship between anti-corruption efforts, anti-public corruption, and achieving a human right to water. What about Detroit? So when Detroit declared bankruptcy, as Detroit was entering bankruptcy, it was making some really difficult decisions about how it was going to manage its systems, and it realized there were lots of delinquent water bills. So Detroit said, if we can keep ourselves out of bankruptcy, if we can pay off some creditors, we start cracking down on some of these water disconnections. So they started disconnecting people from water, including really vulnerable people. As you can imagine, massive protests, a censure by Catarina de Albuquerque, who was the UN Special Rapporteur for the human right to water, against the city of Detroit. They were censured by the bankruptcy court. Detroit began a repayment process, began a process for people to challenge their cutoffs, but it was a really difficult situation because here's a city that's struggling to stay afloat and needs revenue, and people aren't paying their water bills. Now you can say, well, water should be free, but do you remember where your last Happy Meal toy is? Do you remember where your car is? Free things people don't tend to take very good care of. If people internalize the cost of their consumption, if they take better care of their water, they conserve it more. We need to make sure water is affordable, but we also need to make sure that water systems recover enough costs that they're financially viable. So some of the challenges that Detroit was facing, and you might say, well, everybody should get enough water to live. Here's the problem with that argument. There's only two kinds of people in the world. People with enough water to live and dead people. Everybody alive already has enough water to live, which means when we're talking about the human right to water, we're not talking about enough water to live. We're talking about enough water to live a dignified life. That's a more important question, but it's a much more complicated question, and that's the question the city of Detroit's been struggling with. Now, I'm going to spend the last little bit here talking, just comparing two case studies. They happened at the exact same time, which is why they're so interesting, and in neighboring countries. So one is in South Africa. South Africa is the first country to ever recognize a constitutional right to water in 1997. After they recognized the constitutional right to water, they created a flat fee. Everybody just pays a flat fee for their water services and the water comes. Now, what would you do if once you paid your water fee into your utility, what would you do with your water? You wouldn't take very good care of it because you're not going to charge you any more water for using more water, which is exactly what people did. So people wasted their water. The city of Johannesburg was losing over 600 billion liters of water every year, unaccounted for. Only 1% of the water they were delivering was generating any revenue. It was simply not ecologically or economically viable or sustainable. At a cost to the city of nearly $400 million a year. So it wasn't sustainable. So what did the city of Johannesburg do? The city of Johannesburg decided that they would maintain this flat rate approach for some neighborhoods, but for many historically black neighborhoods, black townships, they created a new system. And that new system was free basic water. What free basic water was is that they said they would provide to every household in townships like Fiery and Soweto, they would provide 4 kiloliters per month free to every household. And then after that, you would have to prepay, literally go feed the meter with coins to keep your water supply running. Now, they thought 4 kiloliters per household per month would work out to about 25 liters per person per day, which is the WHO recommended quantity. But the public utility grossly underestimated how many people were living in these households. So they would burn through their 4 kiloliters per month early on, and then everybody would have to go out and prepay for their water. Then a fire breaks out in Fiery, and everyone to try and put the fire out has to run out with their pockets full of change to feed the meters to try and put a fire out. Mazibuko, a resident of Fiery, sues and says this is a violation of our constitutional right to water. It goes to the trial court, and the trial court says, you're right. You are owed 50 liters per person per day right now. The utility of the city of Johannesburg appeals, goes to the appellate court. Appellate court says, it is a violation of your constitutional right to water. You are owed 42 liters per person per day, and you have to achieve that in 6 months. So I'm hoping you're already seeing one of the challenges with the human right to water, which is institutional competency. The judges who are looking at these rights, they don't know how much water to give, or how much to charge, or how long it will take to achieve these goals. So it goes to the Constitutional Court of South Africa, the highest court in South Africa, and they end up deferring to the utility and saying, we don't know. We don't know how long it should take. We don't know how much water it should be. So whatever the public utility says goes, and Mazibuko lost the lawsuit. Now, at the exact same time, strangely enough, in neighboring Botswana, the Basarwa people, who've been living for thousands of years in the Kalahari, the Botswanan government wants to create a new game preserve, and they don't want any people on there, even though this is the Basarwa's traditional lands. So rather than helping the Basarwa stay on their traditional land, rather than doing, what they did is they capped the Basarwa's wells, so they lost their water supply. The Basarwa people, because this is their home, refused to leave. So rather than leave, they stayed and they died. A lawyer representing the Basarwa tried to bring a claim. There is no constitutional right to water in Botswana, but there is a right to be free from degrading and inhumane treatment. So they brought that claim all the way to the highest court in Botswana and won. So I think one of the lessons that we can take from comparing what happened in Botswana and South Africa is, number one, again, the role of racism in water policy and what a dangerous thing it is. But also that oftentimes these positive guarantees of water rights and constitutions are complex and difficult to implement when there isn't institutional competency in the courts to decide these kinds of cases. Maybe we can do better for people by looking at the more jurisprudentially mature civil rights that exist. Rights to due process, rights to equal protection, rights to freedom of speech and religion as they relate to water policy. That some of these more jurisprudentially mature and easily enforceable constitutional guarantees may serve to secure water. I think it's interesting that the country with a constitutional right to water could not vindicate those rights. The country without one ended up vindicating those rights. Now, as I end, I just want to say one caution, which is there are lots of limits to the human right to water. One of the limits to the human right to water is that it's about humans, which means it's anthropocentric. It's not thinking about the environment. It's not thinking about endangered species, which means this is something we have to be careful when we develop a human right to water, is to consider ecological conditions. Additionally, the human right to water is generally held to be controlled by individuals. This is an individual right. But a lot of global inequality in water is not between individuals, they're between communities and between nations. So a lot of the challenges with water policy are dealing with communal water rights amongst indigenous people. This is certainly true here in the Western United States. And a lot of these challenges are between jurisdictions. So in virtually every river basin on Earth, there is a hydrohegemon. Some jurisdiction who's so big and so strong, has so much money and so much economic and political power that they get their way when it comes to water. Think about every international river basin in the world, and you can probably think of who they are. The Mekong, it's China. In the Jordan, it's Israel. In the Colorado River, it's complicated. Because you might think it's the United States of America, but states like Utah and Arizona may be much more closely aligned hydrodiplomatically with Mexico than they are with California. California is the hydrohegemon of the Colorado River Basin. And so a lot of the challenge of addressing global inequality when it comes to water policy can't be achieved through a human right to water, because much of the inequality that's experienced around the world is experienced between communities and between nations. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, there's enormous richness in that presentation. Thank you very much, Professor Larson. It raises a great many questions for us to discuss. And we do have about 25 minutes for questions. If you have a question, and I hope you do, please come on up over here and speak into the microphone. You're welcome to come up in line if you'd like. That way, our recording technology can hear you, and everyone else in the room can hear you as well. So we will go until 1 p.m. with a discussion, and turn the time back to you.
And I'll talk about all kinds of water issues. If you don't want to talk about the human right to water and you want to talk about the drought here, I can do that.
Well, sure. Let's talk about that. Hi, I'm Darren. I'm just wondering. So I don't know. Right, a huge problem we're facing is the drought, and we're facing, we're using way too much water out of the Colorado River and diverting water before it hits the Great Salt Lake and things like that. And I could formulate a better question if I had more time, but this can be more multi-purpose. Then is. How does the concept of a human right to water help us at all here? I mean, these seem like really pragmatic problems. And I love the idea of a human right to water, but I'm seeing a little bit of a disconnect maybe.
So I don't know that the human right to water, in terms of the transboundary management of something like the Colorado River, the human right to water doesn't play a massive role, although I will suggest that it plays some role. One of the ways in which I'll suggest that it plays a role is, for those of you who spent much time in the Navajo Nation, you'll know the Navajo Nation is very large. And you have relatively small communities that are widely distributed. The Navajo Nation, because it's so large, I'm not going to get into the complexities of Native American water rights law right now, but because of the size of its reservation, it's conceivable that the Navajo have a fairly large water right allocation from the Colorado River. They have not settled their water rights claims. They have not quantified their water rights, but if they ever did, it's possible that's a lot of water. But that amount of water doesn't necessarily do the Navajo much good if they don't have the infrastructure to move it to all of these small communities. And they don't have economies of scale. There aren't large cities that they're moving this amount of water to. So we have to find ways for these smaller communities to access the water to which they have a right that may not make a ton of economic sense. And this may be a way in which the human right to water plays a role inside of the Colorado River Basin. The larger issue of managing the Colorado River Basin that has some relationship to human rights is this is largely about agriculture. 70% of the water supply in the Colorado River Basin is used by irrigated agriculture. A 9% reduction in agricultural use doubles the amount of water available for everybody else, which means what we need is more efficient agriculture. But the problem is that we're not going to come to that by a bunch of people wagging their fingers and lecturing farmers. We are all farmers. We all benefit from agriculture. They are feeding us. And so to help farmers achieve those kinds of efficiencies is expensive, which means we all have to invest in them and in agriculture to help them achieve those efficiencies. And I think there's a human right component to recognizing the vulnerability of these agricultural communities and not leaving them behind or lecturing them, but recognizing that we need to be there for them.
Hi, my name's Spencer. I was just wondering, what's the basis in Sharia law for water rights?
So there's the basis is articulated. It's shafa and shirb. So under Sharia law, there are three things that everyone has to have in common, which is grass, fire, and water. Mm-hmm. And so underneath that provision of Sharia is the idea that water has to be held in common. From that has been interpreted shafa and shirb, the right to irrigate and the right to drink. And then there's been all sorts of varying sectarian interpretations under each one of those.
And is that based in the Quran or is it based in Hadith?
Hadith, largely, yeah.
Okay.
But it's all interconnected.
It all comes together. Mm-hmm. But I was just wondering. Yeah. Thank you.
Is it okay if I ask two questions?
Please.
Fantastic. My name is Kyl Drummond. I'm wondering how, if we take the concept that environmental resources, if are owned by nations and peoples and not states, how do we reconcile indigenous rights to water and environmental resources with states' rights?
So, an excellent question. This is difficult in different parts of the world because many parts of the world have different answers. So, for example, Australia has largely done away with the terra nullius doctrine, which is the terra nullius meaning land of no one. They've done away with that in recognizing land rights for Aboriginal Australians. But aqua nullius, the idea of water belonging to no one, remains somewhat embedded in Australian water rights. So we're still a long way away in Australia from recognizing sort of formal recognition of most Aboriginal water rights. If you look at Jordan, which is another country I've worked in a lot, it's really complicated because there were certain tribes that were loyal to the Hashemites during World War I, and because of their loyalty, they were rewarded by with their own independent water rights. So most water in Jordan is actually owned by the crown, but there are some indigenous communities that actually have their own independently owned water rights. Here in the United States, it's even more complicated. So here in the United States, under what's called the Winters Doctrine, which is a Supreme Court decision from 1906, every Native American reservation has an implicit right to water. Now, again, this is only for federally recognized Native American tribes, but they have an implicit right to water. Now, they have the minimum amount of water that's necessary to meet the primary purpose of their reservation. The primary purpose of their reservation is to establish a permanent homeland. What's the minimum amount of water? Historically, we've said it's the amount of water they need to farm their practically irrigable acreage. But you can imagine how controversial that is because there's lots of tribes who are saying, we don't want to farm, we want ecotourism, or we want to build semiconductors. And so farming isn't relevant to what we want to do with our water. And so recognizing that in many countries there are actually independent indigenous water rights that are recognized by the states, whereas in other countries it's far less formal and far weaker recognition of indigenous water rights.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you so much. And then just the second question, what are the retributions that some groups face for water violations? One example would be the draining of the Mesopotamian marshes. Like, who accounts for that and how do you recover from it?
Oh, so now we're getting into the complexities of like water dispute resolution and forgiveness, which is really culturally embedded. One of the great challenges of water is that oftentimes water is not, we're not really arguing about water. So I'll tell you a story. So I was once I was mediating a case between a Native American tribe and an irrigation district. And the irrigation district, after lots of negotiations, said that they would provide a certain amount of water piped and treated to the tribe. And the tribe said, we don't want their water, we want our water. And I confess at the time I was really frustrated. And I thought, one H2O molecule is fungible, it's as good as any other, what's the difference? And it took a lot of humility and a lot of listening for me to understand. But one of the other things I had to come to understand is water was a vehicle through which we were having a much more complicated negotiation, right? This wasn't totally about water. This was about history and about past abuses and about recognition of sovereignty that water by itself couldn't resolve. And reaching forgiveness and acceptance of draining traditional waters required a lot of that recognition of past wrongs. Now, in particular, in the context of Mesopotamia, this is again going back to Islamic law. There's some really fascinating approaches, ritual forgiveness rituals, the Qadi. So having negotiators who help people, you come and ask for forgiveness 7 times for having breached the water right, and after the 7th time you go through a shared vision exercise, and then there's ritual forgiveness. And so I think there's actually a lot to learn from Bedouin communities who've learned how to manage these water resources between them and to find ways to achieve peace and forgiveness.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Ben Abbott from Environmental Science and Sustainability, and loved the presentation.
Thanks.
And really appreciated the focus on the hydrosocial cycle. So it's not just about the gradient in the groundwater, it's going towards money. And money is flowing more and more in our increasingly polarized society to a smaller group of people. And I'm interested in why we make choices to sometimes manage supply and sometimes manage demand. And you gave an example of how we tend to manage demand for groups that don't have money, right? So, okay, we're going to figure out how you can deal with less while making sure we have enough supply for others. And so in that context, I wonder, what do you see patterns in successful water projects and patterns in like the world's worst water projects that just make things worse?
The fantastic question, which actually helpful that I still have the slide up because this slide might actually be a useful slide in talking about this. So a lot of my research focuses on water augmentation technology, so desalination, cloud seeding, bulk water imports, and the way in which investing in these augmentations can either aggravate or mitigate water conflict. And so one of the things Israel's been thinking about for a long time, and this has been together with its co-riparians, the Palestinians and Jordanians, they've been thinking about building a desalination plant on the Gulf of Aqaba, providing water to both sides of Jordan and Israel conceding a certain amount of water from the Kinneret to the Jordanians, and then pumping the reject stream, the wastewater from desalination, up to the top of the mountains, dropping it down the mountains, and using that reject stream to refill the Dead Sea. It's called the Red Dead Project. It's never gotten off the ground for a bunch of reasons. You can probably guess why. But what's been interesting is that here in the Colorado River Basin, we've had conversations about something similar. We've talked about building a desalination plant in the Sea of Cortez, Mexico giving up some of its rights to the Colorado River. And then one of the main reasons that we have struggled to find a long-term solution in the Colorado River is California's allocated 4.4 million acre feet every single year. An acre foot is about 326,000 gallons. So California's allocated about 4.4 million acre feet of Colorado River water every year. 3.1 million of those 4.4 million are controlled by one irrigation district, the Imperial Irrigation District, one of the most powerful irrigation districts in the country. But that irrigation district has the Salton Sea, which is this large inland water body that's been drying up like the Dead Sea and exposing all this toxic dust that's making children in the area really sick. And so the farmers in the Imperial Irrigation District have said, we will not play games and we will not accept shortage on the Colorado River. We will demand our full 3.1 million allocation unless we find a solution to the Salton Sea issue. And that's been really difficult. I think in the long term, we're going to have to find that solution, but that solution may mean augmentation. Now, this goes back to the bigger question about finding, like, what do we do with augmentation, which is, in my experience, there are three priorities in water policy. Priority number one is understand water. Priority number two is conserve water. And priority number three is, if necessary, augment the water. The problem is that we usually skip number one. Water conservation, for many places now, is relatively expensive. Most of the low-hanging conservation fruit has been picked. So if we're going to conserve more, we're going to have to spend more. But we don't know where to spend the money if we don't have better data. So investing more in improved models, investing more in improved metering of wells especially. There are very few universals in water policy. I've traveled all over the world and worked in many countries. Every river, indeed every segment of every river, is different. There's only one universal that I have seen, and that is rural people do not want to meter their wells anywhere in the world. In Lebanon, in Australia, in Ecuador, in Arizona, no one wants to put a meter on their well. And so step number one isn't actually conservation. I think step number one is just we need a better hand on our data. In terms of conservation is going to be expensive, but we're going to have to, and most of it's going to have to be invested in agriculture. And so one of the challenges of this is that you have, right now, people want to tell you they're going to build this giant desalination plant and it's going to solve all of our problems and no one's going to have to make any sacrifices. I'm actually a desalination optimist. I think it will be a part of our water portfolio. It's come a long way. So in 1980, you could desalinate, you could produce 1 cubic meter of fresh water from seawater at about 35 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. The best systems in the world now can do that at about 2.5 kilowatt hours. So the technology's advanced significantly, enough so that back in the olden days, the only people who had desal plants were really energy-rich, really water-poor countries like Saudi Arabia. Now lots of countries have desalination plants. California has the Poseidon plant in Carlsbad. Desal will play a role in our future, but that future's too far off. New desalination plants, even if we build them, are more than a decade away. And telling people we're going to build desalination plants is kind of like walking up to somebody who just lost their job and doesn't have any health insurance and is getting evicted from their house and they're going to have open heart surgery tomorrow and saying, have you thought about law school? Like, maybe law school is a good idea for that person. Maybe they should think about it, but not now. Like, things are bad. We need to come up with some real problems. And the drought is very serious. And the way that we're going to get through, and right now, let's just be clear. There is no getting through this drought. This isn't a drought. This is climate change. This is a new normal. We have to learn how to live in a new hydrologic reality in the river. The way we're going to learn to live in that reality is, at least in the short term, we're going to have to find ways to conserve our way through it. But conservation, just like augmentation, is going to take money. Yeah.
So you talked about like education about water, and I was wondering what that would look like in a local situation, but also in like an institutional situation where like South Africa didn't understand how much water people really need. So what would it take to help those leaders and those like government officials to understand that?
So another excellent question. This is tough because so water education at like the local level, teaching people to value water, is something I'm really passionate about. And one of the challenges with our modern society is we live disconnected very often from our water supply. Mm-hmm. Our water supply is in pipes beneath our feet and we don't think about it and live with it. And so I think having people live with their water, live a little closer to their water. One of my favorite things to do is something called a river basin game, which is you take a big table and you roll marbles down the middle of it, and people try and divert marbles like water into different areas. And just having people live in another person's shoe in a water game, like have a city learn to play a game where they're the farmer, and have the farmer learn to play a game where they're the city or they're the power plant or they're the wetland, and learn how in water there are no winners unless we all win. Now, the real challenge is, like you're talking about, what do we do about education at the level where the government needs to be educated? More expansion of stakeholder participation is really important. So you saw in Cochabamba, Bolivia, like a lack of respect or understanding for the necessity, the social necessity of traditional water gathering. Ignorance of that ends up leading to policy failures. So you need to have robust stakeholder engagement. You need to be able to have local communities who are playing a role. I'll give you a really good example of this that happens all the time in the development of water treatment in developing countries, which is you'll go into a country and you'll identify the contaminants of concern. You'll say, we're going to treat your water and we're going to put the system and we're going to give you, water that complies with the EPA's maximum contaminant levels or with the WHO's recommendations. But the problem is that to do that, you have to avoid disinfectant byproduct contamination. So disinfectant byproducts, if you have a lot of organic pollution in the water and you zap it with disinfectant, you'll create byproducts like total trihalomethanes, which are carcinogenic. And so we here in this room have the luxury of worrying about getting cancer from our water. We get to worry about maybe my water will give me cancer in 50 years. There are people all over the world who don't have that luxury. They're worried about cholera tomorrow. And so having their input saying, that fancy system you're talking about, and you're talking about dropping disinfectant levels, I don't need that system. I can't die of cholera tomorrow. You're rich. You don't understand that fear. So I think stakeholder engagement is really important. It has to be a part of the legal process, and there needs to be claims so that they can assert stakeholder engagement. The risk, though, is too much stakeholder engagement. Oftentimes, too many voices in the room, too high a transaction cost, and it's difficult to move forward. So finding the right balance on enough stakeholder engagement so that we know how to address the problem, but not so much that it gums up the works and we're moving too slowly, is one of the challenges of water policy.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Lexanne Climbs. I'm an environmental science major. You talked a little bit earlier about agricultural issues and how we need to reduce water use from our ag people, from our farmers. And I was just wondering how much of that problem is based on the old U.S. water rights of like use it or lose it, and what of it has to do with the fact that our food industry is basically like, hey, let's grow alfalfa in the middle of the desert. And just what ideas do you have on that?
Yeah, so fantastic question. First of all, on use it or lose it. So, water law. So under U.S. Western, so the United States is kind of split roughly in Eastern and Western water law. Eastern water law still looks like Roman water law. It's riparian rights. Western water law is a completely different legal regime called prior appropriation. Your water rights are based on who got there first. First in time, first in rights. Same rule that governs who gets the last box of Cocoa Krispies at the grocery store, just whoever gets there first. Now, this is a great way to get people who want to invest a lot of money to run into the desert. If you tell them run into the desert and the winner gets the most valuable molecule in the universe, it's a great way to get people to build a desert. It's a terrible way to manage a desert. Mm-hmm. So we're stuck with a lot of very old high priority water rights that are locked up in particular uses that are difficult to do. Now, another aspect of water rights law is forfeiture. So if you do not use your water right for 5 years, you lose it. And which incentivize waste, because you'll have a farmer who's like, I can cut my water consumption in half and still get the same productivity, but I won't do that because if I don't use my whole water right, I'll lose part of it. I don't want to lose half of it, so I'll just waste my water anyway. There's a couple of things that we can do to avoid that problem. Number one is something we're just starting to do in Arizona now. It's an experiment Utah should keep its eyes on, is we've created something called a conservation plan. As long as you are filing a conservation plan and you've dedicated that water to a particular conservation use, you're shielded from forfeiture. And so this has been a really helpful way to encourage farmers to invest in efficiency without worrying about losing their water rights. Now, the question about crop type, super important. It's been really controversial. So there have been large Saudi conglomerates that could have come into Arizona, drilled a bunch of really deep wells, and are growing alfalfa for Saudi cows. And Arizonans are outraged, which is a little strange because Arizonans are exporting their water in the form of alfalfa and watermelons and cotton and grapefruit all the time, right? The very nature of exporting anything means you're exporting your water because water's inside of everything. Now, what can we do to help people shift to more efficient crops is really important. So this is something I've thought a lot about, which is in Arizona, for example, you have a lot of farmers who are growing cotton or alfalfa or corn, and their growing season is in the summer. So they're taking water out of the river during the time when it's at its lowest point. If we got them to shift to barley, they would be able to take out in the winter when water's at its highest point. It would save us so much water. The challenge is that they don't make enough money selling barley because they can only sell it for feed unless, and knowing where I am, unless we have more malt houses in Arizona, because then they can sell it to malt houses and they can sell it at a premium and make more money. The same has been true, by the way, for farmers who are looking to shift to a crop type called Waiuli. Waiuli is a rubber plant. It's really robust and resilient, it gets through droughts really well. So we're talking to a lot of farmers. You need to shift to growing Waiuli. You'll make a whole bunch of money, you'll sell rubber, but we need tire factories to start investing in these communities. And so you need to create the market for farmers to be able to make the efficiency shift.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, my name's Caleb Harding. I'm a computer science major. So you said we need better models, and I was like, ooh, exciting. But one thing in terms of water that's kind of bothered me as I've been in Utah is just looking at some of the cultural elements of Utah, especially with like lawns. If everyone needs to have their like immaculate lawn. So thinking in terms of those conservation kind of policies, do you think there is any like short-term practical policies that could have an impact? Like, I don't know, like not people limiting lawns or something, I don't know.
So it's difficult. First of all, a lot of people are moving out to places like Utah and Arizona from the Midwest, and so they bring this cultural idea of I want to have my big tree and my big grassy lawn. So one part of like water education is getting people to embrace a desert lifestyle. Deserts are beautiful. They're every bit as beautiful as any other part of the world. Love living in a desert, have desert plants. It's great. But another aspect of this is, and this is probably a simple proposal, but one that I care about, which is there are a lot of homeowners associations throughout the West that don't allow you to desertscape your yard, or that don't allow you to shift from actual to artificial turf. One thing that would go a long way towards helping this is there's a lot of people who want to make the shift. They want the money savings to not have to water their lawn. So for most domestic uses, if you have a watered lawn, it's nearly 90% of your domestic water uses are going to water your lawn. A lot of people want to save that water. They want to save the money. What's getting in their way is their homeowners association. And so we've passed laws in lots of Western states that have said homeowners associations can't ban political signs. Homeowners associations can't ban solar panels. Maybe one positive step is homeowners associations, we just ban them from outlawing zero-scaped yards or artificial turf.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Sean Miller, sort of an appropriate technology question. You mentioned Zeromass water.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent is that a solution? How expensive is it? Is it good for poor? Does it solve Navajo problems? Does it help irrigation? What can we do with that?
Right.
Maybe explain how it works.
So Zeromass water is developed by a friend and colleague of mine, Cody Friesen. The technology is called the Source. It's really, really fascinating technology. The engineers who built it are going to be better at describing it than I am. But basically using photovoltaic solar cells as an energy source to create coolant coils. And these coolant coils are condensing atmospheric water vapor down into a tube. The tube then runs through a remineralization process, then a small bit of disinfectant, and produces drinking water at the household level. It's a really exciting technology. It has all kinds of promises. It is limited, though. It's limited in the following sense. One panel will run you $7,000, and under ideal humidity conditions in the air will produce about 7 liters of water a day. For most people, that just doesn't make much sense from a cost perspective. Now, photovoltaic solar cells have been declining in cost for a long time, so it's conceivable that this will be a more affordable solution. It's also the kind of thing where for these sort of distributed communities like the Navajo, maybe this is something that we can talk about ways to invest in a settlement. So Right now, there's a lot of downstream people from the Navajo on the Colorado River who have a lot of interest in seeing the Navajo settle their water rights claim. And one of the things that they might be able to talk with the Navajo about is, what if we put small-scale distributed water treatment for uranium-contaminated wells, and what if we invest in small-scale household water augmentation projects like this? If we pay that money to help you with your infrastructure, will you agree to take less in a water rights settlement, less water? We would not have achieved the kind of settlements that we have in the Colorado River Basin, including the recent 500+ agreement, if it were not for our Native American neighbors. The Gila River Indian community, the Colorado River Indian tribes, they've been major leaders in getting us to a better, safer, more sustainable place. I think the Navajo are going to have a really important voice going forward, but to help them have that voice, we need to help them solve some of the most complicated water problems that they have. And I think these kinds of small-scale, household-level distributed systems may be a part. You're just going to need the people who are looking for the settlement to invest the money.
Thank you so much for an enormously rich discussion. I hope that our conversation today has inspired you to be an advocate for better distribution of water. It certainly has to me. So please join me in a warm thank you to our speaker today.